There was a time in Los Angeles when black success wasn't just possible, it was happening out loud, in full view. This wasn't some abstract idea or small cluster of hopeful entrepreneurs. We're talking about a real, thriving, and powerful community of black business owners, doctors, entertainers, and working families who had carved out a space where they could live, grow, and succeed despite the odds. This part of LA was often referred to as the West Coast Harlem, or LA's Black Wall Street, and it earned that name. It had everything: banks, hospitals, newspapers, nightclubs, insurance companies, churches, schools, all black-owned and community-centered. But if you've never heard of it before, that's not an accident. The history books didn't just forget it. The city, the state, and the systems in power worked actively to erase it. Because what happened to this community wasn't just neglect, it was sabotage. To understand how this all started, you have to go back to the early 1900s. Back then, Los Angeles was marketed as a kind of paradise, a clean, crime-free, opportunity-rich escape from the violent racism of the South. Real estate developers and train companies placed ads in black newspapers across the country, telling African Americans that if they moved to California, they could finally live free, build wealth, and give their kids a better future. And thousands of families did just that. They left places like Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Mississippi and headed west. By the 1920s and 30s, black neighborhoods in South Central LA and around Central Avenue were growing fast. And these weren't temporary communities. They were deeply rooted, with churches, social clubs, political organizations, and some of the most important black institutions in California history. At the center of all this was Central Avenue, a street that, for a time, was the heart and soul of Black Los Angeles. It was more than just a street. It was an ecosystem. You could find everything you needed right there. Black-owned banks helped people get loans when no one else would. Black doctors ran clinics and hospitals because mainstream medical institutions refused to treat black patients with dignity. There were law firms, schools, jazz record shops, clothing stores, and even newspapers like the California Eagle, which was one of the most influential black publications in the country. This wasn't just survival, it was success. It was self-determination. And it was a loud refusal to be shut out of the American dream. But the crown jewel of Central Avenue was its music scene. This wasn't just local entertainment. This was a nationally respected jazz hub that rivaled anything happening in Harlem. If you were a top jazz act in the 1930s or 40s, you didn't just perform in New York or Chicago. You had to come to LA and play Central. The Club Alabama was the epicenter. Just across the street was the Dunbar Hotel, where legends like Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, and Nat King Cole stayed and jammed. Black and white audiences packed the venues despite segregation. Music poured out into the streets, and the culture was so vibrant that Hollywood started paying attention. But that attention came with a cost. While black culture thrived in these spaces, LA's white elite, especially in government and real estate, started seeing it as a threat. Not because of crime or disorder, but because black people were becoming economically independent. And history shows us that every time that happens, a backlash follows. LA's answer to black progress wasn't a violent mob, it was policy. It came in the form of redlining, zoning laws, and eventually the construction of massive freeways that tore straight through the heart of these neighborhoods. This wasn't just development, it was targeted destruction. They didn't just build the 10 freeway, they built it through the middle of black neighborhoods, displacing families, cutting off businesses, and choking off entire communities from the economic lifelines they had created for themselves. And let's be clear, this wasn't some natural byproduct of modernization. This was a strategy. Redlining maps labeled black areas as hazardous investments, which meant banks refused loans. Home values dropped on purpose. Schools in black neighborhoods were underfunded by design. At the same time, white families were given favorable mortgage terms and pushed into suburban developments like Compton and Inglewood, which were originally whites only. The federal government backed this racial segregation through the FHA, while the city quietly used urban renewal projects to demolish black businesses and replace them with parking lots, freeways, or government buildings. It wasn't progress, it was erasure. During World War II, something unexpected happened. Japanese Americans were forced into internment camps, leaving entire sections of Little Tokyo vacant. Black migrants from the South, many working in LA's booming wartime factories, moved into those empty buildings. And just like that, a new black neighborhood was born, Bronzeville. For a brief time, Bronzeville became another vibrant hub of black life. Churches were started in old storefronts, jazz returned to the clubs, black-owned businesses popped up again, and the community did what it always had. It thrived. But even that moment of hope was short-lived. After the war, Japanese Americans returned to reclaim their homes, and rightfully so. But instead of helping both communities coexist or expand, the city chose to push black residents out yet again. No resources were given to help the black families relocate or rebuild. The Bronzeville moment ended almost as quickly as it started. It was another instance of black people being used as temporary labor, only to be discarded once they were no longer needed. And while LA was growing richer from the industries these residents helped fuel, the black community was once again forced to scatter, with fewer resources than ever before. What followed was a slow, painful unraveling of everything that had been built. The clubs on Central Avenue closed, the businesses shuttered, families that had owned homes for decades were priced out or forced to sell. The city rebranded these areas as blighted and used that label to justify more displacement. And as people left or were pushed out, the myth started to take root. The lie that black communities in LA had always been poor, always been broken, always been behind. But that's not true. The truth is, they had wealth, they had power, they had culture, and they were targeted. If you drive down Central Avenue today, you'll see remnants of what once was, the shell of the Dunbar Hotel, a few historical markers, maybe a mural or two. But most people have no idea what they're looking at. There's no major museum, no curriculum in schools, no films or documentaries that tell the whole truth. The erasure was nearly complete, and yet the memory still lives, in the families who stayed, in the descendants of those entrepreneurs, in the music, and in the fight to reclaim that legacy. Because what happened in LA wasn't just a loss of land or money, it was a loss of possibility, a deliberate effort to prevent black Angelenos from having generational wealth, political power, or cultural visibility. And unless we understand that, unless we name it for what it was, history will keep repeating itself. These weren't unintended consequences. This was policy. This was racism, executed with precision, and now it's our job to remember it, tell it, and make sure the next generation knows what was really lost and why.